They told you Jesus was a prophet. They told you he was the Messiah. But what they didn't tell you is what the Jews who walked beside him truly believed, what they wrote in secret, what they buried in shame. If the men who knew him best left behind a different story, would you have the courage to hear it? For 2,000 years, the world has been told one version of history, a version shaped by emperors, councils, and wars fought in the name of salvation. But before the Gospels were canonized, before Christianity became the sword and crown of Rome, there existed other texts, darker texts, Jewish texts that painted a portrait so scandalous, so heretical, that they were hunted, burned, and erased from memory. These were not the writings of enemies. They were the words of his own people, the scribes, the rabbis, the witnesses who stood in the shadow of his miracles and walked away unconvinced, or worse, convinced of something else entirely. Their testimony was never meant to survive. The Talmud speaks in whispers. It hides its secrets in layers of commentary, in coded language that only the initiated can decode. And buried deep within its ancient pages, there lies a name. Yeshu, not Jesus, not the Anointed One. Yeshu, the sorcerer, the deceiver, the one who led Israel astray with witchcraft learned in the forbidden temples of Egypt. This is not folklore. This is what they wrote. In the tractate Sanhedrin, the rabbis describe a man who performed signs and wonders, yes, but not through the power of God, through something darker. They say he was a student of magic, that he carved incantations into his flesh and summoned forces no righteous man should ever call upon. They say he was tried, condemned, and executed not as a martyr, but as a blasphemer, and they say he deserved it. But here is where the story becomes dangerous, because the Talmud does not deny the miracles. It does not claim the healings were false or the resurrections mere tricks of theater. It admits them. It confesses that Yeshu had power, real power, the kind that bends the fabric of reality, the kind that makes the blind see and the dead walk, but it calls that power evil. How do you reconcile that? How do you stand before a man who raises the dead and call him a servant of darkness? Unless you know something the rest of the world does not, unless you have seen something that cannot be unseen. The Jewish texts are not alone in their accusations. There are fragments, whispers carried across centuries that speak of Jesus journeying to the east, to India, to Tibet, to lands where the old gods still breathed, and the mysteries of the cosmos were taught in temples carved from mountains. Some say he learned from the Buddhists. Others say he delved into practices far older, far more dangerous, practices that predate even the Torah, practices that were forbidden for a reason. In the 2nd century, a Greek philosopher named Celsus wrote a polemic so vicious, so detailed, that the church spent centuries trying to erase it. He claimed to have spoken with Jewish elders, men who remembered the stories their grandfathers told. Stories of a young man named Yeshu, who was born in scandal, the illegitimate son of a Roman soldier named Pantera, a man who grew up in shame and sought power to reclaim his honor, a man who went to Egypt, the land of sorcery, and returned with abilities that defied nature. Celsus did not write this to slander a myth. He wrote it because he believed it was true, and the Jews who taught him believed it too. But why? Why would the chosen people reject their own Messiah? Why would they look upon a man who fulfilled prophecy, who healed the sick and fed the multitudes, and call him a fraud, unless the prophecies he fulfilled were not the ones they were waiting for, unless the signs he performed were not the signs of salvation, but of something else? The rabbis knew their scriptures. They knew every line, every letter, every hidden meaning woven into the Torah. And when Yeshu came preaching a new covenant, a new law, a new way to God that bypassed the temple and the priesthood, they did not see liberation. They saw heresy. They saw a man who claimed equality with God, who forgave sins as if he held the keys to heaven, who promised eternal life to those who followed him. And they remembered the warnings. In Deuteronomy, the law is clear. If a prophet arises and performs signs and wonders, but leads you to worship other gods or follow other teachings, you must not listen to him, even if his miracles are real, even if his words move the heavens. Because the test of a true prophet is not power, it is obedience, and Yeshu was not obedient. He broke the Sabbath. He touched the unclean. He dined with sinners and called the Pharisees hypocrites to their faces. He overturned the tables of the money changers and declared the temple a den of thieves. He claimed authority over the law itself, saying that he had come not to abolish it but to fulfill it, and in doing so, he rewrote it. To the faithful, this was not reformation, it was rebellion. The Book of Toledot Yeshu is a text most have never heard of. It exists in fragments, in manuscripts hidden in dusty archives and private collections, written in Hebrew and Aramaic by hands that trembled with rage. It is not scripture. It is not holy. It is a counter-gospel, a shadow narrative that tells the story of Jesus from the perspective of those who despised him. And what it reveals is unspeakable. According to the Toledot, Yeshu was not born of a virgin. He was born of betrayal. His mother, Miriam, was betrothed to a righteous man, but she was seduced by a Roman soldier named Pandera. When her pregnancy was discovered, the community was torn apart. Some believed her story of divine conception. Others knew the truth. And the child that grew in her womb carried the stain of illegitimacy, a mark that would follow him all his days. The text does not soften this. It does not grant mercy or poetic license. It paints Yeshu as a bastard child who grew into a cunning man, desperate to prove his worth in a society that would never accept him. And so he sought power, not through prayer or righteousness, but through secrets stolen from the temple itself. The story goes that Yeshu infiltrated the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber of the temple where the name of God was kept. The Shem HaMepharash, the explicit name, the 72-letter name that held the power of creation itself. It was said that anyone who learned this name could command reality, could perform miracles, could rival the angels. But it was guarded, forbidden, hidden behind veils and curses that would strike down any unworthy soul who dared approach. Yeshu approached. He carved the name into his skin, or so the legend claims. He cut it into his thigh so that even if he was searched, even if he was stripped bare, the secret would remain with him. And when he left the temple, he carried with him the power of God. Stolen, profaned, wielded by a man the priests considered unworthy. And with that power, he began to perform miracles. But they were not miracles of God. They were tricks, abominations, sorcery dressed in the robes of divinity. He healed the sick not through faith, but through incantations. He cast out demons not through prayer, but through binding spells learned in the darkest corners of Egypt. He raised the dead, not as acts of compassion, but as demonstrations of power, as proof that he had transcended the limits of mortal flesh, and the people believed him. That is what terrified the rabbis. Not that Yeshu was a fraud, but that he was convincing, that thousands followed him, that his words spread like fire through the land, igniting hearts and minds, turning children against fathers and wives against husbands, that he claimed to be the Son of God, the Messiah, the one who would sit at the right hand of the Almighty, and the people believed him. So the rabbis did what they had to do. They gathered evidence, they called witnesses, they brought him before the Sanhedrin and accused him of blasphemy, of sorcery, of leading Israel into idolatry. And when he refused to recant, when he stood before them and declared that they would see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, they condemned him. Not because he was innocent, because he was guilty. The Toledot Yeshu claims that after his execution, his followers stole the body, that they hid it and then proclaimed he had risen from the dead, that the resurrection was not a divine act, but a calculated deception designed to keep the movement alive. And it worked. The lie spread across the Roman Empire, converting Gentiles and Jews alike, until it became the largest religion the world has ever known, built on a stolen corpse and a forged miracle. But here is the question that haunts every scholar who reads these texts, every historian who wrestles with the contradictions. What if both versions are true? What if Yeshu did steal the name of God? What if he did perform miracles through forbidden power? And what if those miracles were real anyway? What if God allowed it? There is a teaching in Jewish mysticism, a dark and uncomfortable idea that even the forces of evil serve a divine purpose. That Satan himself is not a rebel, but an agent of God, a prosecutor in the cosmic courtroom who tests the faithful and exposes the wicked. What if Yeshu was the same, a figure of power, of charisma, of undeniable supernatural ability, sent not to save, but to test, to separate those who follow the law from those who follow signs and wonders? The early Christians were not fools. They knew the Jewish objections. They knew the accusations of sorcery and illegitimacy. The Gospel of Matthew goes out of its way to address the virgin birth, to trace Jesus' lineage back to David, to insist that prophecy was fulfilled. The Gospel of John opens with a declaration of divinity so absolute that it bypasses the entire question of earthly origins. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But the Jews were not convinced, and their texts, their hidden texts, tell a different story, a story where the miracles are real, but the source is corrupt, where the power is undeniable, but the message is poison, where the man called Jesus was not the Son of God, but a magician who stole fire from heaven and burned the world with it. And they have kept that story alive for 2,000 years. It is written in the margins of the Talmud, whispered in the academies, passed down in oral traditions that never made it into official canon. It is the forbidden history, the shadow gospel, the testimony of those who were there and refused to kneel. Because they knew something the rest of the world forgot, that not all power comes from God, that not all miracles are blessings, that a man can perform signs and wonders and still be leading you toward damnation, and that sometimes the greatest test of faith is not whether you believe in the supernatural, but whether you can discern its source. The Jews who rejected Jesus were not blind. They were watching, they were testing, and they saw something in him that made them turn away. The question is, what did they see? The gods didn't erase this story. They just made sure you'd never think to look for it. But now you have, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. If you want to uncover the next buried truth, follow us.